Remove Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from the courtroom. Hold her in contempt. She didn't shout. She didn't resist. She simply stood, unshaken, unwavering, as the bailiff stepped forward. The room didn't gasp. It froze. Because everyone knew this wasn't about law anymore. It was about power. But outside those courtroom walls, America wasn't watching quietly. Phones lit up, clips spread, and what millions saw was not a disruption. It was a woman being punished for refusing to shrink. And this story, it isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about what happens when speaking truthfully becomes the greatest threat of all. While inspired by real tensions in America's legal and political systems, this dramatized story is fictional. The names are real. The stakes, in conscience, power, and speech, are very much so. Because even when the events are imagined, the emotions behind them are absolutely real. Stay with us. Because the moment she was silenced was the exact moment the country found its voice. It was the kind of Monday morning that whispered routine. The coffee in Alexandria. Ocasio-Cortez's hand was still hot. The steam curled upward like punctuation on a quiet thought as she stepped into her office. Heels soft against the hallway carpet. Blazer just barely resisting the spring breeze from the open Capitol window. Her staff hadn't arrived yet. Good. She liked the quiet before the noise. She placed her coffee on the corner of her desk, opened her laptop, and began scanning the day's schedule. Meetings, a housing bill amendment review, one radio interview at 3:15. Nothing out of the ordinary until she saw it. An envelope. Alone. Centered. Placed with a kind of symmetry that wasn't accidental. It wasn't congressional mail. No franking mark. No interoffice sleeve. Just ivory cardstock. Thick enough to feel serious in the fingertips. Sealed in gold foil, with one line embossed in black ink. United States Supreme Court. Confidential. She didn't open it right away, not out of fear, but instinct. Her hand hovered. She tilted her head slightly, reading the words again. Then slowly, carefully, she slid a finger beneath the flap and opened it. The letter inside was only 3 pages long, but every word felt like a detour into somewhere no one had warned her about. A federal subpoena, filed under judicial order, and signed, not by a federal magistrate, not a committee, but by Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Alexandria blinked. Once. Twice. She scanned it again. The language was careful, almost evasive. Words like review of conduct, possible impropriety, undue influence on institutional integrity. Nothing said what it meant, and somehow that said everything. Her breath stayed steady, but her fingers curled tighter around the paper. Supreme Court justices don't issue subpoenas to sitting members of Congress. That's not how branches check each other. That's how they threaten each other. She reached for her phone. "Cal," she said when her legal advisor picked up, not bothering with pleasantries. "You busy?" "Always," he said. "What's up?" "I just received something not right." There was a pause. "How bad?" She snapped a photo of the letter, texted it, watched the dots as he typed, stopped, then typed again. Finally, he called. "I'm gonna be blunt," Cal said. "They're not asking for your testimony. They're picking their target." AOC exhaled, slow. "This isn't procedure. This is performance. They want headlines. They want a villain. And they want it to be someone people listen to." She stood by the window, looking out over the morning sun slanting across the Capitol dome. Somewhere down there, reporters were preparing for another day of statements, spins, and silences. But this wasn't politics. Not really. This was a warning, disguised as a request, delivered with ceremonial gold. She looked back at the envelope. It didn't threaten. It presumed. There were questions already forming in her mind, but none of them had answers yet. Why her? Why now? Why Barrett? But the deeper question lingered like an echo in the room. What were they willing to do if she didn't play along? And somewhere behind that thought, a sharper one began to rise. What if this wasn't a mistake? What if this was the plan? She picked up the envelope again and set it beside her laptop. The coffee had gone cold. But something far more volatile had just begun to simmer. There's a kind of silence that doesn't calm you. It doesn't stretch out peace or make space to think. It just waits, like something coiled at the edge of the room. Alexandria sat alone at her desk, fingers tapping lightly against the closed envelope now resting on the far corner. She had already read the letter 3 times that morning, but the words still clung to the edges of her thoughts like static. Conduct unbecoming an elected official in relation to judicial interference. A phrase so vague it could mean anything, or nothing, which in some ways was worse, because it gave them room to twist whatever came next into whatever served them best. She'd been in high-stakes rooms before. She'd sparred on the House floor, held her own on primetime cable panels, and walked through crowds that weren't always cheering. She'd been underestimated, interrupted, accused of being too loud, too direct, too young, too brown. None of that had stopped her. But this felt different. Not louder, colder. It wasn't just the setting, it was the architecture of the moment. The way the language was built to sound neutral while hiding intention. The fact that it wasn't a subpoena from a standard committee or DOJ. It was from a Supreme Court justice, a name with robes and rules and reverence stitched into every syllable. It wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was a message. She leaned back in her chair, watching the light shift across her office walls. Everything felt too still. Her aides had started to arrive, footsteps soft outside the door, voices muffled. She didn't call anyone in. Not yet. Instead, she stood, crossed to the small cabinet by the bookshelf, and pulled open the drawer where she kept her blue notebook. Not the one for schedules, the one for reminders. The ones that weren't appointments, but anchors. She flipped past pages of quick notes, questions scribbled in train stations, quotes overheard in community centers. Then she landed on the page she was looking for. In bold, ink-dark letters, she had written, "Truth never whispers." She had circled it. Once. Then again. Then a third time. Weeks ago, on a train ride back from New York after visiting a tenant advocacy group. She hadn't meant it to be a motto, but now it stared back at her like it knew something she didn't. She closed the book gently, then laid it flat on her desk. Her navy suit hung on the rack by the door, crisp and unassuming. It was the one she wore when she didn't want her outfit to speak louder than her words. She reached for it, smoothing the shoulder fabric with deliberate care. There would be cameras. She didn't dress for them. She dressed so they couldn't distract from the substance. As she changed, she kept going over the wording of the charge. Judicial interference. What did that even mean, coming from a justice whose ideology was public record, whose decisions impacted millions? But who now accused her of overreach for talking about it? It wasn't just personal, it was structural. She could already hear how they'd try to spin it. She's trying to undermine trust in the judiciary. No, she was trying to remind the country that trust is earned, not inherited with a black robe and a wooden gavel. She fastened the last button, slipped the notebook into her bag, and glanced at her phone. No new texts, just a quiet alert from her calendar. Hearing, 11 a.m. No fear, but she felt the weight of the hour. She took one last look at the desk before stepping out, letting the door click gently behind her. The world outside was waiting, but so was the system inside, and this time it had invited her in, not to speak, but to be spoken over. They'd find out soon enough. She didn't walk into rooms to echo. She walked in to be heard. The car slowed before it stopped. She could already see them, lined up behind the barricades, cameras angled like they were waiting to catch someone tripping over her own name. Reporters didn't shout questions anymore. They asked them like riddles, polite traps, landmines dressed as courtesy. Congresswoman, do you plan to comply fully today? Do you view this as a legal matter or a political one? Any comment on being subpoenaed by a Supreme Court justice? Alexandria didn't break stride. Not rude, just focused. If she stopped for every lens, she'd never make it through the door. The press wasn't the opponent here. They were just the surface tension. The real pressure sat waiting in a chamber lined with authority and assumptions. Her heels tapped lightly on the stone as she walked up the courthouse steps, the sound too clean, too precise. DC had a way of making noise feel orderly, even when everything underneath was chaos. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, nodded once at the guards flanking the door, and stepped inside. The temperature dropped the second she crossed the threshold. The lobby was all marble and restraint. Light streamed in through tall windows, but nothing felt warm. It was the kind of architecture that didn't ask you to be quiet. It demanded it. Every sound, every cough, every shift of a shoe bounced against stone like it didn't belong. A clerk greeted her, voice low. "You'll be shown to the witness area. The hearing will begin shortly." She nodded once, then followed silently. Down one corridor, then another. No small talk, no signage, just empty space that seemed to echo with expectation. They seated her at a long wooden table. Clean surface, no nameplate, just a glass of water and a folder with her name typed in the sterile font. Her attorney sat beside her, calm but alert. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Alexandria looked around the room. There were no flags behind the bench, no jury box, no gallery full of shouting voices, just a few observers. Hand-picked, controlled, sanitized. She adjusted her posture, straightened her notes, checked the microphone, already on, blinking softly, and then the doors opened. Justice Amy Coney Barrett entered like silence wearing shoes. She moved with the grace of someone who didn't need to announce her presence. She carried authority the way others carried breath. Automatic, inescapable. She didn't glance at AOC, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. Just eyes forward, chin high, robe flawless. When she reached the bench, she sat slowly, carefully, like even gravity answered to her. "This is not a trial," Barrett said, her voice steady but cold. "It is a clarification of constitutional respect." Alexandria didn't react, not on the outside. But inside, something shifted. A sentence dressed as a disclaimer, a performance costumed in protocol. If this isn't a trial, she thought, why does it feel like a sentence waiting to be spoken? She glanced at the folder again. No charges, no specifics, just words designed to warn. It was clear now. This wasn't about answering questions. It was about being seen answering them, on their terms, in their space, under their lights. The difference between testimony and display was paper thin in rooms like this. She folded her hands in front of her. Her voice hadn't been called yet, but her presence already had. And sometimes presence is the first act of defiance. It started softly, as these things usually do. The kind of soft that pretends to be fair, wrapping a scalpel in silk. "Congresswoman, for the record, please confirm your date of election to the House of Representatives." Alexandria responded clearly, evenly. "January 3rd, 2019. The prosecutor nodded, scribbled something. "And during your tenure, have you served on any committees overseeing matters related to the judiciary?" "Yes. Oversight and reform." More nodding, no reaction, just boxes being checked. But she felt it coming. That shift, the one that always follows the part that sounds official, the pivot from fact to framing. The prosecutor didn't wait long. "Congresswoman, in March of last year, you tweeted the following: 'Some courts don't serve justice, they serve structure.' Is that accurate?" There it was, not evidence, not testimony, just a pulled quote, floating out of context and waiting to be painted as intention. "Yes," Alexandria said. "That's accurate." He raised an eyebrow. "Do you believe the judiciary, as an institution, lacks legitimacy?" "No," she replied, still composed. "I believe legitimacy requires constant accountability, especially from institutions that don't answer to elections." He leaned forward, voice even. "So you are suggesting that the judiciary should be answerable to political pressure?" "No, I'm saying it should be answerable to the people. And if public scrutiny feels like pressure, perhaps we should ask why." There was a pause, not from uncertainty, but from recalibration. He flipped to the next page. "Let's move on to a speech you gave in Brooklyn last fall. You stated, quote, 'When courts become predictable along party lines, they cease to be arbiters. They become actors.'" "That's correct," Alexandria said, not missing a beat. "And you stand by that?" "I do." He straightened slightly, sensing an opening. "Justice Barrett, as you know, has ruled consistently in alignment with conservative legal interpretations. Are you suggesting she's an actor, not a judge?" Alexandria held his gaze for a moment before answering. I'm suggesting that when patterns begin to look like partisanship, we owe it to the public to ask hard questions. And if that discomforts the powerful, good. Justice that can't stand discomfort doesn't stand at all. The words had weight, not just in the air, but in the posture of the room. You could feel something shift, not explosively, subtly, like the atmosphere before a storm. Barrett's voice cut through the moment like glass sliding across marble. This is not your platform, Congresswoman. Alexandria didn't turn to her. She simply nodded once. Understood. But inside she noted the phrasing. Not this is not the time, or this is not relevant. No, platform. The implication that her words weren't responses, but performance. As if truth and clarity only counted when they were cloaked in passivity. She adjusted her chair slightly, not out of discomfort, just to remind herself that she was still in control of her own spine. The prosecutor continued, this time flipping to a printed article. You've been quoted as saying the Supreme Court is not immune to critique, no matter how high the bench sits. Do you believe that critiques such as yours contribute to erosion of public trust in our courts? She leaned forward, calm but deliberate. I believe silence erodes trust faster than critique ever could, because silence suggests we accept everything exactly as it is, even when it doesn't serve everyone equally. That did it. The murmur in the back of the chamber wasn't loud, but it was real. A small exhale from someone near the gallery, a shift in the shoulders of the clerk on the right. The prosecutor's lips pressed thin. He looked to Barrett. No signal, no response, just the faintest narrowing of the justice's eyes. Something was unraveling, not the facts, the control, and Alexandria could feel it. Not victory, but movement. And that was enough, for now. The lights dimmed slightly as a screen flickered on behind the bench. Alexandria had seen these setups before, usually during committee hearings where exhibits were used to underscore policy points or budget trails. But this was different. This wasn't transparency, it was theater. The prosecutor clicked a remote, and the first image appeared, a screenshot of a tweet from over 2 years ago. It wasn't even hers, just one she had liked, a post by a civil rights lawyer questioning whether lifetime judicial appointments encouraged ideological stagnation. Alexandria recognized it instantly. She hadn't even remembered liking it until now, but she had. Congresswoman, do you acknowledge engaging with this post? I do. He nodded, flipping to the next one. Another like, this time a thread criticizing a ruling about qualified immunity. Do you agree with the sentiments expressed here? I agree with the importance of public scrutiny over legal precedent, yes. Click. Another slide. This one highlighted a post she had liked during the confirmation of a controversial federal judge, someone who had expressed openly a partisan views. The post had said, "This isn't justice, it's placement." Alexandria shifted slightly in her chair, not out of discomfort but focus. She watched as the screen filled with curated evidence, not of actions but of alignment, not of violations, but of opinions. You're not asking about what I did, she said, eyes steady on the prosecutor. You're trying to imply who I am. A pause, then, in a tone that barely masked its satisfaction, he answered, exactly. It was so casual, so clean, as if reducing a public servant's worldview to a curated feed of liked posts was standard practice now. As if implication had replaced inquiry, the gallery shifted, just a little. Chairs moved, a throat cleared. Even Barrett looked up at that one. Not surprised, just aware. Alexandria let the silence hold for a moment. Sometimes silence did more work than 100 rebuttals. She glanced back at the screen, then returned her gaze to the front. You can spend the next hour listing every post I've engaged with, she said, voice calm but resolute. But none of this speaks to my actions. It speaks to your assumptions. Another low hum passed through the room. Not outrage, not disruption, recognition, the kind that ripples when a truth has been spoken plainly, without decoration or defense. The prosecutor tried to recover. Your digital behavior creates a pattern, Congresswoman, a pattern of animosity toward the judicial system, a pattern of accountability, she corrected. If you're reading my thoughts through algorithms, at least be honest about what you're looking for. He faltered slightly. Not enough to lose his place, but enough for the people watching to notice. Enough for the moment to turn from interrogation to exposure. Because what they saw now wasn't a witness unraveling. It was a strategy being revealed. This wasn't an inquiry. It was image control. A carefully edited montage meant to suggest threat where there was none, to imply rebellion where there was only critique. And beyond those walls, on live streams in newsrooms, across timelines, screens were starting to mirror the one in the courtroom. Clips were being captured, words were being pulled, and the shape of the story was beginning to change. It was no longer AOC under fire. It was becoming, what exactly are they afraid of her saying? Alexandria knew what they were doing. She just wasn't going to help them do it. She adjusted her notes, crossed one leg over the other, and waited, not passively, intentionally. Because if they were going to make this about optics, they'd have to learn one thing the hard way. When the truth is clear, no amount of framing can hold it in place. The prosecutor hadn't moved on. He was still circling the same well, still drawing attention to screenshots and likes, like they were confessions. Alexandria stayed calm, but the courtroom had grown heavier, denser somehow, as if everyone was holding in a collective breath, waiting to see how far the script would stretch before it snapped. Then came the shift. AOC responded to a question, firm, articulate, unshaken. And that's when Justice Barrett leaned forward. Just slightly, enough to make it known she wasn't just presiding. She was watching, calculating, signaling the direction this would take. "Congresswoman," Barrett said, voice clipped, "this court expects restraint. You are veering into commentary." Alexandria didn't flinch. "I'm answering questions as asked." "You're editorializing." "No," she replied, measured and deliberate. "I'm contextualizing, which I assume is relevant if the goal is clarity." Barrett didn't respond right away, but she didn't need to. The warning was on the record, a thin line drawn with precision, waiting to be crossed. The prosecutor, emboldened, pivoted again, this time to a quote from an old interview. AOC had criticized the way courts sometimes cloak ideology and procedure. He read it out loud like it was a threat to the Republic. Alexandria looked straight at him. "If that's controversial, maybe the robe is thinner than we thought." Barrett's hand hovered over the gavel. Alexandria paused, then said quietly, but clearly enough that everyone heard it, "If speaking truthfully becomes contempt, then maybe the court is contemptuous of truth." Silence. Not stunned, stilled. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for permission. It takes control of the room. Even the bailiff didn't move. Then slowly but definitively, Barrett struck the gavel. Once. "You are hereby held in contempt of this court." The words fell like cold stone. Alexandria stood. No dramatics, no raised voice, no shouting. She didn't protest. She didn't plead. She simply rose from her seat, adjusted her jacket with one hand, and looked directly at the bench. Her eyes didn't harden. They focused. 2 security officers approached. No cuffs, no resistance, just motion. She didn't turn to the gallery. She didn't scan the faces. Because this wasn't about a spectacle. It was about posture, about not giving power the reaction it expects. As she stepped away from the table, someone in the back let out an audible breath, as though they'd been holding it too long. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer controlled. She walked out with shoulders level, stride steady, expression composed. She didn't leave like someone ejected. She left like someone ready. And that, more than anything said that day, was what people would remember. Because they hadn't silenced her. They had shown exactly why her voice mattered. It was just a moment, barely 17 seconds from gavel to silence. But that clip traveled faster than any press release or legal memo ever could. No edits, no voiceover, just a still courtroom, a steady voice, and a phrase that cracked open something deeper than law. If speaking truthfully becomes contempt, then maybe the court is contemptuous of truth. Someone in the gallery had captured it. Clean angle, clear audio, no shaking. They didn't mean to start a fire, but they did. Within an hour, the clip was posted across 5 platforms. Within 2, it was stitched into reactions, commentary, duets, hashtags, and by nightfall, it had crossed 17 million views. There was no background music, no flashy transitions, just the image of AOC standing calmly, shoulder squared, before two officers escorted her from the chamber. Her face wasn't defiant, it was resolved, and somehow that made it louder than anger ever could. Commentators flooded in from every angle. Cable anchors debated constitutionality with furrowed brows. Political analysts tried to reframe her statement as provocation, but it didn't land. Civil rights attorneys, both young and seasoned, wrote threads breaking down the limits of contempt law and what it meant when it was used to silence, not to maintain order, but to preserve hierarchy. A former federal judge wrote on his blog, "Contempt is for chaos, not conviction." That line alone was reposted 50,000 times in under 6 hours. But the most powerful response didn't come from lawyers or lawmakers. It came from people. A teacher in Ohio played the clip in her 10th grade civics class and asked, "What does accountability look like when power feels uncomfortable?" A warehouse worker in California shared it with the caption, "She didn't shout, she didn't flinch, and still they couldn't handle her." A retired veteran tweeted, "I didn't agree with her politics, but that was courage. Full stop." The comments didn't read like the usual internet pile-on. They read like recognition, like people had seen something they knew too well. That quiet doesn't always mean consent, and composure doesn't mean weakness. Some tried to spin the moment, of course, said she knew what she was doing, that it was all theater, that she wanted to be removed. But even those voices sounded thinner than usual, because when the footage spoke, spin couldn't drown it. What the country saw wasn't rebellion. It was control, not power wielded, but power withstood. And AOC's face, still, composed, deliberate, became more than a screenshot. It became a symbol, not of defiance, not of partisanship, but of what it looks like to remain unshaken when the system demands that you fold. It was the kind of moment no one plans for, the kind that only becomes clear after it's passed, when the world plays it back and realizes that the line wasn't just powerful, it was timely. It met the moment. Or maybe the moment rose to meet it. 17 seconds. No yelling, no theatrics. Just a woman standing, speaking, and being led away for refusing to make her truth small enough to fit into someone else's comfort. And across timelines and kitchen tables and classrooms, the country wasn't asking if she went too far. They were asking why anyone thought that was far at all. By morning, the silence wasn't just broken. It had been replaced with something sharper. It wasn't noise. It was signal. Civil rights attorneys were the first to move. Before sunrise, letters started appearing, open, signed, and unambiguous. One from a coalition of legal scholars called the contempt charge, an overreach so stark it borders on political retaliation. Another reminded the public that respect for the court is not synonymous with obedience to discomfort. These weren't partisan firebrands. These were the types who usually avoided headlines and cameras. But something about this moment pulled them forward. Maybe it was the footage. Maybe it was the fact that AOC never raised her voice, never turned it into theater, just stood there, clear-eyed and calm, until the robe couldn't stand it anymore. By midday, law school professors were submitting op-eds in waves, not think pieces, not hypotheticals, analyses, dissections, constitutional breakdowns. One particularly blistering essay circulated in academic circles within hours. Contempt was designed to preserve order, not to punish discomfort. When a court begins silencing questions, it invites bigger ones. Cable shows latched on, but the usual sensational spin didn't quite stick. The footage had stripped them of plausible deniability. It was hard to paint AOC as disruptive when her tone had been more composed than most morning news anchors. It was hard to accuse her of grandstanding when she hadn't even looked at the gallery on her way out. What viewers saw didn't match what the institution claimed, and that mismatch cracked something open. Even within the halls of Congress, something shifted. A moderate from the Midwest, not known for aligning with her, was overheard saying, "It just feels off. That wasn't procedure. That was something else." Others stayed quiet publicly but texted colleagues with single lines, "Did you see it? And that's not how we do things." Meanwhile, In a holding room just cold enough to remind her of the stakes, Alexandria sat with her back straight, a pencil in hand, and the charge sheet on her lap, flipped over. The irony wasn't lost on her. They'd written her up for contempt, but all she could feel was clarity. She didn't waste time wondering how it looked. The footage would speak louder than any prepared remark. She knew that. What mattered now was what came next. And for that, she needed notes, not for defense, for direction. She started listing questions, sharp, honest ones. Who decides what speech becomes punishable? When does authority cross into suppression? What happens when precedent is used not to protect, but to intimidate? Her handwriting wasn't pretty. The lines were angled, crowded, but each word grounded her. Across town, her team was already working. Legal counsel, communication staff, volunteers, some experienced, some just angry enough to help. They knew she wouldn't want a spectacle. They also knew she wouldn't tolerate being made an example of in silence. The work had already begun because they understood what she did. This wasn't about whether she broke protocol. It was about whether protocol could be weaponized to break her. In the quiet of the holding room, she paused, tapping the pencil once against the page. They wanted to write her into a headline, AOC held in contempt. But the story was writing itself differently. And this time, it wasn't the gavel that would echo. It was the questions. While headlines swirled and clips circled the digital stratosphere, a different kind of work unfolded behind a closed door in a quiet office 2 blocks from the Capitol. No cameras, no statements, just focus. Controlled, methodical, relentless. AOC's legal team hadn't slept. They weren't interested in press hits or cable segments. They had one goal, not just to get the contempt charge dropped, but to expose the very mechanism that allowed it to happen in the first place. The charge itself was flimsy. That much was clear. It lacked legal footing, cited no direct disruption, and depended entirely on interpretation, Barrett's interpretation. But dismissing the charge alone wouldn't be enough. This wasn't just about clearing AOC's name. It was about confronting the process that assumed it could stamp her voice out with a wooden gavel and a robe. So they drafted something bigger, bolder. The motion wasn't written in the usual stilted legalese. It was sharp, deliberate, and structured like a choice laid bare. The title said everything: procedural power versus constitutional principle. In it, they argued not just that the contempt charge was unwarranted, but that the entire proceeding violated basic norms of impartiality. They laid out a clear path. A sitting Supreme Court justice presiding over a hearing, targeting a vocal sitting member of Congress, posed not only a conflict of interest, but a threat to the balance of powers itself. They included precedent, dozens of cases where contempt had been used responsibly, judiciously, sparingly. And then they outlined how, in this case, it had been used politically, emotionally, and selectively, not to restore order, but to assert dominance. They inserted statements from legal experts already reacting in the press, but not as decoration, as confirmation, a rising chorus now brought under oath. But the most important section, the one they spent the most time perfecting, was the final page. It didn't ask for leniency. It didn't beg for reversal. It posed a question. Will this court uphold the principle that power must answer to law, or will it allow law to be bent in service of power? It wasn't a threat, it was a mirror, held up to a system that always claimed to be neutral, but now had to prove it. By the time the document was finalized, the sun had started to break over the city. The team stood in silence for a moment as the printer spilled out the final pages. No high fives, no exhale of relief, just quiet resolve. They knew what they were walking into, but they also knew something else. Something that had become clearer with every hour AOC spent in holding. Every headline that questioned the silence. Every message pouring in from people who saw in her something they had rarely seen in themselves. A woman who didn't raise her voice, but still refused to lower her principles. They filed the motion just before 9 a.m., and as they handed it over, one of the junior clerks, barely out of law school, read the title again and said softly, "This doesn't feel like a filing." One of the attorneys looked at her and replied, "That's because it isn't. It's a challenge. A challenge not just to a courtroom, but to a system long too comfortable assuming no one would ever dare speak clearly from the witness chair." They had. And now the court had to answer. It didn't come from a press conference. It didn't come from AOC's team or an official legal brief. It came from someone no one saw. Someone whose job was to record, not to react. A court reporter, buried behind their stenotype and headphones, filed neatly into the corner of the hearing room. They weren't there to take sides, just to capture the words every pause and breath. And yet, what they captured didn't line up with what the public had been told. At first, the leak appeared on a small legal blog. Just a link, no preface, no commentary. A zip file titled, Crockett Hearing Full Audio plus Transcript.zip. No one claimed it. No one needed to. The internet did what it always does when something feels just a little too quiet for too long. Within hours, the content spread. Uncut audio, verbatim transcript, no edits, no summaries, just everything exactly as it happened. The line that made the world stop. If speaking truthfully becomes contempt, then maybe the court is contemptuous of truth. Was there? But so were all the moments around it. The ones that hadn't been clipped for headlines or shaded in op-eds. Her tone, her restraint, the absence of disorder, no outbursts, no raised voice. Just clean, precise language, measured, respectful, and deeply uncomfortable for the people trying to control the room. And just like that, the story changed shape. Law professors who had waited to weigh in now came forward quickly and bluntly. They published joint statements online, dissecting not just the legality, but the optics. How the courtroom had manufactured a narrative of disruption and disrespect, where none had been present. One professor wrote, "What we're seeing isn't courtroom discipline. It's selective suppression, targeted and tactical." But the breakdowns didn't stay confined to academia. TikTok lawyers and creators, usually focused on labor rights or tenant disputes, jumped on the leak with fast, clear analysis. Stitch by stitch, they walked through the footage, pausing frame by frame. "This isn't justice," one said. "This is image management." Another creator layered Alexandria's now famous line with footage of other hearings. Other witnesses, mostly men, mostly white, speaking far more aggressively without consequence. "Notice the difference?" she asked. "Because the court sure did." Within 24 hours, the leak had reached every corner of the internet. Hashtags emerged, #, contempt of truth, #, letterspeak, #, bench check. Comment sections flooded not just with anger, but with clarity. It wasn't outrage for outrage's sake. It was recognition. People weren't just reacting to a moment. They were confronting a pattern. The court, for its part, stayed silent. No denial, no admission. But the damage was already done. Not because someone had broken protocol, but because someone had preserved the truth when it was most fragile. And somewhere in a holding room still dimly lit by flickering overhead bulbs, Alexandria was handed a printed copy of the leak by one of her aides. No commentary, just a nod. She read in silence. Not surprised, not vindicated, just steady. Because she'd always known the risk wasn't in speaking. It was in being misquoted, reframed, stripped of nuance. Now the record spoke for itself, and that was the shift. She no longer had to prove she'd spoken with care. Now the system had to explain why care made them uncomfortable. The ruling didn't arrive with ceremony, no podium, no televised statement, no somber announcement by a spokesperson. Just a quietly published court order at 11:42 a.m., uploaded to a federal judiciary portal most people had never heard of until today. But within minutes, the link had gone viral. The independent panel of senior federal judges, assembled under emergency protocol due to rising public concern and mounting legal scrutiny, had issued their decision. No fanfare, just 52 pages of reason, and one sentence that would echo far beyond the page. Truth calmly spoken does not disrupt order. It defines it. At its core, the ruling was direct. The contempt charge against Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was vacated in full. The panel unanimously concluded that her conduct in the courtroom did not rise to the level of contemptuous behavior. Her tone, posture, and language remained within the bounds of witness decorum, even when her statements challenged the comfort of the presiding authority. But they didn't stop there. In a pointed section of the opinion, The judges questioned the procedural appropriateness of Justice Amy Coney Barrett's role in the hearing itself. Without naming intentions, they cited serious concerns regarding the perception of impartiality, warning that the blurring of judicial oversight with political discipline risked eroding public trust in the very neutrality the bench was designed to uphold. The legal community reacted instantly. Law school deans reposted the ruling. Former clerks wrote threads titled, "This is how the system checks itself." Even conservative legal commentators, typically hesitant to critique the court, called the language a quiet rebuke with thunder behind it. But for ordinary people watching from phones and laptops, it wasn't the procedural language that hit hardest. It was that single line. Truth calmly spoken does not disrupt order. It defines it. It showed up on banners outside courthouses, on classroom whiteboards, in handwritten notes slipped into library books. Within an hour, someone had already embroidered it onto a tote bag and posted it online. Orders flooded in. It wasn't just a sentence. It was a recognition that Alexandria hadn't been punished for misbehaving, but for not breaking under pressure. And now even the system had to admit it. Some tried to shift the narrative, said the ruling didn't clear her, only removed the penalty. But those arguments collapsed under the weight of the footage, the transcript, and now the ruling itself. Back in her office, Alexandria didn't cheer. She didn't post a victory tweet. She read the document once, then again, highlighting a paragraph that stood out. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was rare. When institutional discipline is triggered not by disorder, but by discomfort, the institution itself must be examined. She sat with that for a while, letting the weight of it settle, not as personal vindication, but as precedent. Outside her window, she could see cameras gathering again. They'd want a comment, a soundbite, a reaction, but she wasn't interested in giving them noise. Not now, because this wasn't just about clearing her name. This was about reminding the system it answers to its principles, not its preferences. And somewhere deep inside that ruling, hidden between the formal language and judicial citations, a quiet truth had been affirmed. She didn't break the court. She showed the country where it had already started to crack. There was no podium waiting for her, no row of microphones clipped with networks logos, no planned statement, just the weight of the building behind her and a path forward that she didn't need to decorate. Alexandria stepped out of the courthouse alone. No legal team trailing behind her. No publicist checking her notes. Just her. Navy suit, slightly wrinkled now from hours of waiting, in a folder tucked neatly under her arm. The air was crisp, one of those DC afternoons where the wind carries a hint of something turning. The cameras were there, of course, waiting, hoping for fire, for vindication, for a soundbite they could cut and recut into something easier to digest. But she didn't give them that. She walked slowly, deliberately, past the press line. A few called out her name, questions trailing after her like fishing lines. She didn't ignore them. She just didn't feed the frenzy. One reporter, more patient than the others, stepped forward, not shouting, just asking, "Do you feel like you won?" She stopped, just briefly, just enough. "You don't always win by raising your voice," she said, eyes steady. "Sometimes you win by refusing to lower it." Then she kept walking. And that was it. No scripted celebration, no spike the ball moment. Because this wasn't about spectacle. It never had been. This was about boundaries, about what happens when someone refuses to shrink, not out of ego, but out of duty to truth. The ruling had spoken. The footage had spoken. And now her silence spoke too. Not as absence, but as presence. The kind of presence that doesn't demand a headline to matter. The kind that holds its shape even when everything around it tries to bend it. Behind her, the courthouse stood as it always had. Tall, imposing, unmoved. But now something inside it had changed. Not the structure, but the memory. The echo of a voice that hadn't shouted, but still refused to be silenced. People watched her walk away and didn't see defiance. They saw discipline. Not the kind that conforms, but the kind that endures. That outlasts the noise because it never needed it in the first place. And in that moment, quiet, uncluttered, unapologetically still, she didn't reclaim anything. She simply reminded the country that she'd never lost it. The rain didn't fall hard. It wasn't the kind that made people run for cover or turn back. It was the kind that lingers, gentle, steady, almost ceremonial. The type of rain that doesn't demand silence, but invites it. Alexandria walked slowly up the courthouse steps, alone once again. No aides pacing ahead to clear a path, no press release handed out in advance, no podium set in place. Just her coat darkening with every drop, and a small notepad folded once in her hand. The wind tugged at the ends of her hair but didn't bother her. She didn't raise a hood. She didn't hold an umbrella. Let the sky do what it would. What waited for her wasn't a press gaggle. It wasn't a crowd primed to chant or cheer. It was something different, quieter, more serious. People stood in clusters at the bottom of the steps. Students, nurses, veterans, janitors still in uniform. No one held signs. No one interrupted. They just stood there, as if to say, we saw it, we remember, and more importantly, we showed up. Alexandria didn't speak right away. She didn't rush to fill the moment with words. She stood still for a beat, taking in the people in front of her and the building behind her, both holding more weight now than they had before. The courthouse hadn't changed, but what it represented for many had cracked open. She looked down once at the paper in her hand, then back at the crowd. Contempt, she said, her voice low but clear, was never about my tone. It was about their fear of clarity. A few heads nodded. A few hands pressed phones to record. Still, no one moved. Because clarity doesn't give power room to hide, she continued. It doesn't yell. It doesn't distort. It just names what's in front of us, and that's often more threatening than any volume. She stepped down one stair, closing the distance just slightly. She wasn't speaking to the cameras. She was speaking to the people who had come to listen, not react. They called it a courtroom, she said, but for a moment it became something else. A place where order was used to disguise discomfort, and discomfort was treated like danger. I wasn't removed for interrupting. I was removed for not shrinking. Someone in the crowd exhaled loudly, a gesture that wasn't planned but felt shared. I didn't come back here for spectacle, and I didn't come back to celebrate a ruling that simply did what was right. I came back because I know how many people don't get that ruling, don't get that second look, don't get heard until the system's already moved on without them. The rain continued, soft but constant. Her voice didn't waver. It didn't harden. It just held. There's something sacred about a voice that remains calm in the face of power, she said. Not quiet, not passive, just unmoved. She paused, letting the quiet stretch for a breath. I wasn't held in contempt because I disrupted. I was held because I didn't disappear. Then she folded the paper in her hand and stepped back. She didn't ask for applause. She didn't need affirmation. The point had already landed, in the silence, in the steadiness, in the people who had gathered not for a headline, but for a moment of clarity that finally felt shared. She descended the steps slowly, the same way she'd arrived. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, just the sound of rain and the echo of a truth that no ruling could contain. The microphone wasn't wired to any broadcast van. There were no stage lights or podium seals, and yet the words she shared next rippled far beyond the stone steps and the soaked coats standing below. She didn't speak about herself, not at first. I want to tell you about someone, she began. He works in this building. He's a janitor. He emptied the trash in the side hallway where I was held after the hearing. She let the words settle before continuing. He looked at me and said, real quiet, like he didn't want anyone to hear. They do this to folks who don't come from where they come from. A murmur ran through the crowd, recognition, the kind that doesn't need to be explained. Alexandria looked out across the umbrellas and rain-streaked jackets. I don't know his name. He didn't give it. Maybe he thought it was safer that way, but I won't forget what he said. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was smudged from the rain, but still legible. This, she said, is from a girl in the Bronx. 13 years old. She DM'd my team yesterday. Said her teacher played the courtroom clip in civics class. She wrote, I didn't know we were allowed to say stuff like that. I thought you had to be quiet if you wanted to stay. Alexandria paused, not for effect, but because the weight of it deserved room. That, she said slowly, is why I didn't sit still. She looked down then back at the crowd, not just at them, but through them, as if she was seeing all the faces who weren't there, but whose stories hung in the air like breath on glass. I didn't stand up for applause, she said, voice steady. I stood so no one else had to kneel next time. Silence, not absence. Presence. She folded the letter again, slid it back into her pocket and added, this wasn't just about one ruling, or one courtroom. It was about how easily the powerful believe they can make someone feel small, so long as they do it politely. She let the rain speak for a moment before offering her last words. Not everyone gets a mic, not everyone gets heard, but if you've ever been told to shrink, to stay soft, to wait your turn, please know your voice is never the problem. Their discomfort is. There were no cheers, just heads nodding, people wiping rain from their cheeks. Some from the weather, some not. And as Alexandria stepped back, she didn't linger. She didn't wave. She just nodded once quietly, as if to say, we're still here, and we're still speaking. The rain was still falling as Alexandria stepped down from the courthouse steps. The crowd didn't disperse. They didn't shout questions or crowd around. Something about her energy, quiet, unyielding, made space for stillness. She didn't stay to pose. She didn't scan for cameras. She simply walked. No entourage. No notes tucked into folders. No staff whispering where to look or when to wave. Just her, coat clinging slightly at the shoulders, heels clicking against the wet pavement with steady rhythm. Reporters tried, gently at first. Congresswoman, just one more question. Would you consider this a turning point? Do you feel vindicated? She didn't stop. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't dismissal. It was design. Every silence was a choice, and this one spoke louder than a dozen statements ever could. But just as she reached the edge of the crowd, someone near the front, a student maybe, held out their phone, not to record, but like they were trying to offer something. Their face wasn't asking for content. It was asking for acknowledgement. And Alexandria paused, just for a breath. She leaned in slightly, not for the camera but for the person. And then, almost too quiet for the microphones, she said, they didn't silence me. They showed the world why I speak. Then she turned and kept walking. No one followed. Not right away, because they needed a second to register what had just landed. By evening, that line had become more than a moment. It became the moment. First it was tweeted, then screenshotted, then painted. A street artist in Brooklyn stenciled it on a red brick wall before dawn. A high school senior in Portland printed it in block letters across a thrifted jacket. By noon it was a slogan. By sunset it was a signal. The image most people shared was simple. A silhouette of her walking away from the courthouse, head level, umbrella-less, with those 9 words layered in white across the gray. They didn't silence me. They showed the world why I speak. People wore it, posted it. Some whispered it to themselves after long shifts or tense conversations. It wasn't just about Alexandria anymore. It was about everyone who'd ever been asked to tone it down, take a seat, smile more, speak less. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that a courtroom designed to mute her had turned into a megaphone. And Alexandria? She didn't post anything that day. No speech clips, no quotes pulled from the press. Instead, she returned to her office quietly, sat with her team, reviewed what came next. Because for her, this wasn't a crescendo. It was a continuation. The work, after all, had never been about the volume. It had always been about the clarity. And now in silence, the country was finally hearing it. The halls of the Supreme Court are not designed for noise. Every inch, from the polished floors to the vaulted ceilings, is built to absorb sound, not amplify it. But lately, even the silence had a texture to it. Tight, bristling, uncertain. Inside Barrett's chambers, the quiet wasn't peace. It was pressure. The law clerks, brilliant, loyal, methodical, had stopped asking questions in meetings. Now they whispered them in hallways. Small ones at first. Why this hearing? Why her? But they grew sharper with each article, each ruling, each clip of Alexandria standing tall against a charge that had already collapsed under public scrutiny. One clerk, usually composed to the point of unreadable, asked it out loud over lunch. "Should we have recused?" No one answered. They just shifted in their chairs and looked down at their trays. No one dared say it to Barrett's face, but the unease was spreading. Not because the ruling had gone against her. That happened in courts. That was part of the job. It was the why that weighed heavy. The appearance of the decision. The unmistakable scent of retribution wrapped in process. Across the street, former allies were going quiet. Not dramatically, not all at once, but noticeably. A conservative think tank removed a pre-scheduled profile piece on Barrett from its homepage. A podcast episode featuring her prior rulings was quietly pulled. No statement, just absence. The kind that says more than a denial ever could. One prominent legal commentator, who had once defended Barrett's judicial philosophy in op-eds, now declined to comment when asked about the AOC hearing. Another, speaking under the safety of background attribution, said plainly, "It looked personal." When a judge makes it personal, the robe doesn't protect the institution. It stains it. Inside her office, Barrett carried on. She still showed up, still held briefings, still issued decisions on other cases, most of them routine. But something was missing, her usual shield of deference, the quiet respect that often followed her presence, even among critics. Now when she walked past certain clerks, they paused their typing, not to show deference, but to measure her. Meanwhile, outside, Alexandria said nothing. No interview, no tweet, no leaked memo. And somehow that silence grew louder than anything coming from the court. Because it wasn't passive, it was practiced. It was discipline, the kind that forces others to explain themselves in the vacuum where outrage would normally live. The kind that makes institutions look inward and ask not what did she say, but why did it hit so hard? AOC didn't need to clap back. The ruling had spoken. The people had echoed it. Now the court had to sit with its own image. Not the ceremonial one etched in stone, but the real one reflected back through a public that had watched a Supreme Court justice attempt to hold a congresswoman in contempt and fail. And in a country where power often survives because it's never forced to explain itself, something rare had occurred. One woman's quiet resistance had made the highest bench in the land feel not unchallengeable, but exposed. The walls hadn't crumbled, but they'd creaked, and the silence inside them, once regal, now sounded an awful lot like doubt. It landed on the docket with no fanfare, just a timestamp, a PDF, and two names that hadn't left the national conversation in weeks. Ocasio-Cortez versus Barrett. But this time, it wasn't about contempt or optics. It was a legal bombshell, carefully wrapped in constitutional argument, a formal motion for recusal. AOC's legal team had chosen their moment, not in anger, not in haste, but with timing that cut deeper than outrage ever could. The filing was crisp, footnoted, unflinching. Its thesis wasn't theatrical, it was surgical. Judicial impartiality is not measured solely by action, but by alignment. The heart of the motion wasn't just what had happened in court, it was what had preceded it. Emails had leaked, not by accident, and not denied. Internal DOJ communications between Barrett and prosecutors closely tied to the Federalist Society surfaced. Nothing explosive in isolation, a line here, a tone there. But when read together, it painted a troubling portrait, not of coordination, but of presumption. A justice who appeared too comfortable with one side of the courtroom before the hearing had even begun. One phrase pulled from a flagged email thread weeks before AOC's subpoena made the rounds online. If we don't preserve the dignity of the judiciary now, we risk losing it completely. Out of context, it might have sounded noble, but placed against the backdrop of the hearing, it read more like justification. Cable news erupted. Progressive hosts leaned in. Preserve dignity or protect narrative. Even some centrists began to flinch. One longtime Supreme Court correspondent noted, "It's not what she said, it's who she said it to and when." Constitutional law professors debated the motion on primetime panels. Conservative pundits tried to dismiss it as political theater, but even they struggled to defend the perception problem. The Washington Post ran a headline that struck right at the court's foundation. Did Barrett turn the bench into a podium? In legal circles, the motion was more than symbolic. It forced a conversation that institutions usually avoided. Because recusal, when it involves a sitting Supreme Court justice, isn't just about ethics. It's about legitimacy. It's about the soul of neutrality, the illusion of the blindfold on Lady Justice. Barrett's office issued a carefully worded statement. The justice stands by her conduct and denies any impropriety. But it didn't answer the question the motion asked, not whether she believed she was fair, but whether the public had reason to believe otherwise. In AOC, she remained characteristically calm. When pressed by a journalist in the Capitol hallway, she said only, "If the law requires the appearance of fairness, then this motion isn't an attack. It's a reminder." No raised voice, no soundbite, just pressure, applied with the kind of precision that rattled stone columns more than shouting ever could. Inside the Supreme Court, the motion had a different effect. It wasn't about winning, it was about making the institution flinch. And it had. Clerks whispered. Former judges weighed in anonymously. Even a retired justice was quoted saying, "It's not the accusation that haunts. It's the fact we all understand why it landed." The motion didn't just sting, it lingered. It became the paper proof that what happened in that courtroom wasn't just a clash of ideas, but of power, of perception, of responsibility. AOC hadn't just defended herself. She had flipped the question, if Justice Barrett was the one holding the gavel, who exactly was putting her above the law? It started with a guest lecture at Howard Law. A professor dimmed the lights, played the now iconic 17-second clip of AOC in that courtroom, then paused at mid-sentence. Not for drama, but for dissection. "Watch her posture. Watch the choice of silence over escalation," he said. "What we're witnessing isn't defiance. It's constitutional choreography." Across the country, other classrooms followed. At Yale, a constitutional law seminar reframed their entire syllabus to include a unit titled Procedural Power and Public Perception, Ocasio-Cortez v. Barrett. In a Denver civics class, a high school teacher played the same clip to a room of restless seniors. By the time it ended, no one shuffled their phones. One student raised her hand and said softly, "Is that how change actually looks?" It wasn't just about legal precedent, it was posture, tone, the deliberate calm under heat, a new kind of courtroom resistance, one without the dramatics, but with all the tension, the kind that left a mark not just on rulings, but on memory. In a public middle school in Atlanta, a black 8th grader watched silently, then wrote in her notebook, "I've never seen someone look like me stand so calmly in that space. It didn't feel like she was asking to be let in. It felt like she knew she already belonged." The clip didn't preach, it didn't explode, it just remained. It echoed in small-town libraries where teachers printed transcripts for mock trials. It slipped into AP government lesson plans, not as opinion, but as material. What constitutes contempt? What defines dignity? Who decides what counts as disruption? Some parents protested, calling it political, but the teachers stood firm. One said, "If we can show students how a voice can hold ground without shouting, that's not partisanship. That's democracy." Meanwhile, AOC never commented on the classroom impact. She didn't post screenshots, didn't retweet the viral TikToks of students reenacting her line. But her office began receiving envelopes, one from a civics club in Wisconsin, another from a teacher in Queens, handwritten notes in looping cursive or jagged pen. They didn't say thank you. They said, "We noticed." And that was enough. In a world where moments so often burn bright then vanish, this one did something stranger. It settled into curriculum, into dialogue, into the way students ask questions. No one crowned it a revolution. But in classrooms filled with fluorescent lights and unstacked chairs, something had shifted, not in volume, in presence. The chambers were colder than usual, not by temperature, but by tone. The Judicial Ethics Subcommittee had convened with an urgency rarely seen in such circles. No cameras, no microphones, just transcripts, affidavits, in a phrase that now echoed far beyond the marble walls. Truth calmly spoken does not disrupt order. It defines it. Over 3 days, they reviewed everything: courtroom footage, leaked audio, Barrett's written rationale, the now viral clip of AOC, even private communications between the Justice and External Counsel aligned with ideologically charged networks. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. This wasn't just about decorum. It was about precedent. The draft report, nearly 200 pages long, began dryly with procedural preambles. But by page 7, the temperature changed. The words grew sharper, the intent clearer. The robe should shield justice, not wield fear. That sentence, inserted by a junior clerk who didn't expect it to survive revisions, ended up in the executive summary. It would later be quoted on the Senate floor, printed in The Atlantic, stitched into TikTok explainer videos, and underlined in law school handbooks. The panel didn't accuse Barrett of bias. That would have required direct proof, a paper trail too clean to exist. Instead, they spoke of disproportionate response, institutional dissonance, and a dangerous misalignment between judicial temperament and democratic accountability. They called for a review of how contempt powers are wielded, suggested reforms, quietly encouraged internal audits of all cases where courtroom decorum had been used to silence critique. And then came the final recommendation, written with the precision of a scalpel and the weight of a hammer. We recommend Justice Barrett recuse herself from all future proceedings wherein judicial conduct or ethical neutrality are in question until such time as public confidence may be restored. Barrett did not hold a press conference. She issued no personal statement. But the next morning, a memo was posted on the official Supreme Court docket. Justice Barrett will not participate in the forthcoming hearings related to judicial procedural review. No apology, just absence. The media swarmed, some claiming it was a retreat, others calling it strategy. Legal pundits filled nightly segments debating the meaning of silence in a space built on interpretation. But in communities far from D.C., the reaction was simpler. In a cafe in New Mexico, an older woman folded her newspaper and said, "Guess the bench isn't above the law after all." In a community college in Milwaukee, a pre-law student wrote in the margin of her notebook, "She didn't even raise her voice, and still the system blinked." AOC, for her part, didn't gloat. She issued a single understated post. "Some truths are too important to shout. They're meant to be stood in." No photos, no hashtags. Behind the scenes, her office returned to work. Legislative sessions, community initiatives, a new bill proposal on judicial transparency and digital record access. But something had changed. Not in her, perhaps, but around her. People watch differently now. They listen longer. Not for fire, for clarity. The subcommittee's report wasn't a takedown. It wasn't even retribution. It was a reminder. That authority, when wielded recklessly, loses the one thing it needs most, legitimacy. And that courage, when rooted in stillness, can echo louder than any gavel. They came with raincoats tied at the waist, homemade posters curling at the corners, and voices that hadn't been used in protest since the 60s, or never at all. The courthouse steps had quieted, but the echo moved outward like rings in water. From Boston to Bakersfield, signs began to appear outside civic centers and campuses. Let her speak. Truth has no gavel. Contempt is not a crime. It wasn't a march. It wasn't a riot. It was something slower, quieter. Neighbors knocking on neighbors' doors. Unions printing flyers. Retired teachers forwarding transcripts. Black pastors reading her quotes from the pulpit. Subreddits organizing reading groups. Even talk radio, usually allergic to nuance, couldn't resist the clip where she stood and said nothing, and somehow made it feel like everything. 1 week later, AOC walked into a folding chair town hall in Rochester. No teleprompter, no press pool, no phalanx of aides whispering bullet points, just a mic stand with a little yellow tape to hold the base together, and a PA system borrowed from a local church. The room was a former middle school gym, now half converted into a community center. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Kids from the after-school program were asked to keep it down. They stayed anyway, sitting crisscross on the edge of the floor with notebooks and juice boxes. AOC didn't start with a speech. She started by asking, "What's on your mind?" At first, the questions came easy, about healthcare, local potholes, whether the Postal Service would cut weekend delivery again. Then a woman in her 70s stood up slowly from the second row. She wore a brown cardigan and had a voice like worn oak. "I never trusted Congress," and she said. "Still don't. But that day, in that courtroom, I don't know. You spoke like someone who knew what it meant to be talked over. And then you didn't just speak. You didn't flinch. And that told me something." There was no applause, just the sound of someone exhaling behind her. Another man raised his hand. He introduced himself as a former corrections officer. "You didn't curse. You didn't yell. But I've never seen anyone stand so tall in a room designed to shrink people." From the back, a teenage girl asked if she could record for TikTok. AOC laughed softly and nodded. "It's not about making it viral," the girl said. "It's about making it feel like we were there too." AOC didn't try to turn the conversation into a stump speech. She didn't pivot to talking points. Instead, she asked the woman in the cardigan what first made her stop trusting Congress. The woman said, "It wasn't one thing. It was everything. Small lies, big ones, and silence when it mattered most." AOC nodded. "And now, I'm still cautious," the woman admitted, "but I'm not silent." That night, the town hall wasn't broadcast on national television, but clips made their way across Facebook and neighborhood listservs. A former teacher in Nebraska stitched it into a Zoom civics lesson. A barbershop in Atlanta played the audio on loop through a Bluetooth speaker, and a librarian in Duluth used it to kick off her book club's new theme. Voices that weren't meant to be quiet. The message didn't need banners. It didn't ask for campaign donations. It just asked for people to remember what it looked like when someone faced the full weight of power and didn't try to shout it down, but simply stood their ground. And in that room on that night, people didn't applaud a politician. They remembered what it felt like to be spoken to like citizens. And maybe, just maybe, they started listening again, not to the noise, but to the stillness that had once dared to interrupt it. The courtroom was now dust and silence. The microphones were long packed away. Cameras had turned to newer chaos. But in a quiet apartment above a laundromat in Queens, AOC sat by the window, journal open, pen hovering above the page. Outside, the hum of the city returned to its old rhythm. Garbage trucks reversing, kids kicking a basketball against a curb, a mother yelling, "Dinner!" from a third-floor fire escape. But inside the room, time moved slower, deliberate. She wrote in longhand. No crossouts, the kind of writing meant only for herself. Her back slightly hunched, a sweatshirt draped over the chair, coffee half full beside her, cold but untouched. The legal battle had ended days ago, but the emotional tide kept rolling in. Memories of marble silence, of gavel cracks, of the weight in her chest that never seemed to leave even as the verdict had. She paused, looked out the window. Then, as if reading her own words aloud, her voice rose in her head, not like a declaration, but like a remembering. "They tried to shrink the space I occupied. I expanded it instead, not by force, just by staying in it." She didn't smile at the sentence, just underlined it once, slowly, then moved on to the next blank line. Down the block, a different kind of ink was taking shape. On the wall of a local charter school, two students worked in hushed focus. The older one, a girl with green paint under her nails and headphones pulled halfway off her ears, sketched the outline of AOC's face on the brick. The younger one, maybe 10, held up a color printout for reference, creased from being folded into a backpack for weeks. They'd been at it for hours, their backpacks strewn with brushes, rags, and half-used tubes of red, black, and indigo. They didn't ask permission. They didn't wait for funding. They just started, like every revolution that mattered. At the top of the mural, in careful block letters, "You can jail a voice, but you cannot unhear it." Cars passed by. Some honked, some slowed. One woman rolled down her window and shouted, "That's the girl who stood up to the judge, right?" The younger student turned and said, with no hesitation, "No, that's the woman who didn't sit down." In a church basement in Detroit, an elder read aloud from a printout of the court transcript. In a living room in El Paso, a mother and daughter paused a YouTube clip of the moment AOC was removed from the courtroom. Not because it was shocking, but because they wanted to replay how calm she looked as she stood. In a college dorm in Montana, a first-year law student added, "Procedural power versus constitutional principle," to her mock trial prep list. And back in Queens, AOC closed her journal and tucked it onto a shelf. She didn't reread what she had written. She never did. That wasn't the point. The act of writing wasn't for legacy. It was for anchoring, for remembering who you were when the world tried to tell you who you couldn't be. She stood, pulled the curtain shut, and moved to the kitchen to finally warm her coffee. Legacy wasn't marble statues or best-selling memoirs. It was moments that lived in the mouths of others, repeated in classrooms and barbershops, and whispered between parents and children. It was in how someone walked a little taller because they'd seen her refuse to bow, and it was still unfolding, on brick walls and school murals, and in the silent resolve of people who didn't need to shout to be heard. Legacy, she knew now, wasn't about being remembered. It was about reminding others they never had to disappear. This story reminds us that real strength doesn't always roar. It often stands still, steady, and unshaken. AOC's journey wasn't about grand speeches or courtroom theatrics. It was about staying rooted in truth when the system tried to make her small. Her silence became a louder force than outrage. And in that stillness, countless people, students, janitors, everyday Americans, saw themselves reflected with dignity. It's a powerful reminder that representation is not just about being seen, but about being heard, even when the world tries to mute you. What about you? Have you ever stayed silent, not out of fear, but because your calm presence spoke louder than any argument could? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.